Mrs Main, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I would like to begin by moving that this House consider local museums. I should perhaps explain the genesis of this debate to members, as many people have asked me why I have brought up this interesting subject. 2 months ago, there was a threat to one of the local museums in my constituency, a council-supported museum, the Stirling Smith, was threatened with closure following the publication of proposals by the local authority to remove its budget over the next 5 years. Some members may, in fact, have signed my early day motion to bring pressure to bear. That pressure was ultimately successful because, in addition to honourable members in this House, there was a huge public petition and the Council decided not to remove funding from the Stirling Smith, which was a very good decision.
For the honourable gentleman for giving way and for securing this important debate. Does he agree with me that it's concerning on the issue of local authority funded museums that 39% have seen funding cut and 85% have cut their hours, and obviously that's going to have a knock-on effect on the wonderful service they provide, such as the Argyll Heritage Centre in my constituency in Barnsley?
I'm grateful for the honourable lady's intervention, and I'm going to come on to talk about that very subject in my speech, if she will bear with me. That being said, I believe that it's time for this House to consider the impact that local museums have on our country, our local communities. There's a lot of major issues that affect our museums, and I will speak about a number of these today. I also look forward to hearing from other members from across the United Kingdom here about them talk about their local museums. In Stirling, we have a number of museums.
Can I pay tribute to the D.H. Lawrence Birthplace Museum in Eastwood in my constituency? We're very fortunate to have such a famous literary figure who was born in Eastwood, and really I would like to do more, like us to be able to do more to celebrate him. But does he agree with me that given local authority cuts are so drastic, that lottery funding needs shaking up? Cities can't get all this funding. Lottery cash needs to be going to towns as well, so we can do more to protect and promote our local museums.
Ask Mr Kerr to respond to that. We are having little mini speeches. There are plenty of opportunities if the honourable members had expressed desire to speak, or if they try to catch my eye. But Mr Kerr, if we keep interventions brief. Thank you, Mr Kerr.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her intervention and for the issue she highlights, and for highlighting, of course, the importance of the heritage that our museums represent. But also they represent much more than that. In Stirling, we have a number of museums. The Stirling Smith is the principal museum of the city. We also have the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Museum in Stirling Castle, and the Dunblane Museum, and a number of other smaller museums. This is alongside the major tourist attractions that we have in Stirling, such as Stirling Castle, home to the famous Stirling Heads, which are of international importance.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. In Hartlepool, we have a local museum, the Royal Navy Museum of the North, and a volunteer-run museum at the Yough Battery on the headland. Would my honourable friend agree that such independent museums are equally important to the local economy and the tourist industry?
They absolutely are important, and these museums, such as the one the honourable gentleman refers to, build pride in our heritage, define who we are as a people. The Battle of Bannockburn Visitor Centre, which tells visitors about the most important battle in the history of Scotland, and perhaps I would add, indeed, England. In fact, and then there's the Wallace Monument, which holds William Wallace's original sword, an impressive sight, standing some 5 foot 4 inches high. I had the Secretary of State for Defence visit my constituency recently, and I took him on a little tour, and we passed by the field of the Battle of Bannockburn, and I told him what happened there. And then we passed by Stirling Bridge, and I told him about what had happened there. And he said, "Is there anywhere around here that I will feel safe?" And I said, "I don't think so, Secretary of State." But it's a glorious... It is a glorious history that we celebrate, and our museums play an important part in preserving it, archiving it, and displaying it. When the threatened closure of the the Smith Art Gallery Museum happened, I dropped in to speak to the director of the museum, Dr. Elspeth King, who herself is a phenomena. A 5-minute conversation with Elspeth is more informative than many hours of sitting in this place listening to debates, I can assure you. She's a treasure trove of knowledge, and her contribution to civic life in Stirling is exemplary as the chief custodian of the history of our city and district. The Stirling Smith is a fantastic museum which was founded in 1869. It was based on the philanthropy of Thomas Stuart Smith, who is the only artist in Scotland so far to have set up a museum and art gallery for the public. Thomas Smith made his money from the sale of the Glastonbury estate and from his success as a painter, and he signed his will promising the money to the Provost of Stirling to set up a museum in November of 1869, and he died, sadly, a few weeks later. Philanthropists like Smith have set up museums all across the country, and unlike with libraries, which were often set up the same way, there is no statutory duty for councils to provide museums. Philanthropy of this nature is of huge significance and essential for the future of museums.
My honourable friend take an intervention.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. In my constituency of Aberdeen South, we have the Gordon Highlanders Museum, a proud Scottish regiment, which Winston Churchill had described as one of the finest in the world. It has the same challenges, and at the moment it has a fundraising campaign where they're looking to raise £100,000 a year over the next 2 years, and it's because of the generosity and spirit of Aberdonians. They are being successful in that endeavour. Will he join me in congratulating all the people who have supported that initiative, and also welcome that the Council has given them money in their recent budget?
And I do join with my honourable friend in congratulating the generosity of the people of Aberdeen. That's something that often doesn't run together in a sentence. But on this occasion, it absolutely does. The generosity of the people of Aberdeen. There are many... You're not from Aberdeen, are you?
Member, obviously representing the fine city of York, we are littered with amazing museums, but there is a real challenge, and the fact that local authority cuts has meant that funding for museums has also been cut, and ultimately it means that some people are having to pay to access these collections. Shouldn't they be accessible to all the public for free?
I totally agree with the issue around accessibility. There are many advantages to companies and individuals making payments to museums, to support museums, but the major national ones in London, Glasgow and Edinburgh often get a bigger share of the pie than the smaller ones. In Stirling, we have superb commercial engagement from local companies such as United Auctions, who are a major sponsor to the Stirling Smith. I would urge more national companies and people of significant wealth to not ignore their local museums. The Stirling Smith's most...
When he's making an excellent point, can I out-name check all the other museums mentioned so far as chair of the all-party British Museum Group? And just to reinforce his point, is he aware of the programme that the British Museum is doing to lend its collections to local and regional museums for what is a national museum, and that can help boost the attractiveness and the visitor numbers to regional museums and local museums, which would help them?
This is wonderful news, and I certainly embrace the opportunity to have aspects of the collection of the British Museum come to Stirling and appear in Stirling Smith Museum, if that is at all possible, and I hope it is. The most famous exhibit in the, one of the most famous exhibits in the Stirling Smith Museum is a football. It is the world's oldest football, Mrs. Main. It is a football that was found resting in the rafters of the Great Hall of Stirling Castle, having been kicked up there sometime during the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots, perhaps even by the great lady herself. The football is just one of a number of Stirling's artefacts that have toured internationally. The football visited the World Cup when it was held in Germany in 2006. And the museum also holds the oldest curling stone in the world, pertinent given the fact we've just had the Winter Olympics. These kinds of artefacts of global significance are in many local collections around the country. The international impact of these objects and the ability to use them to improve our cultural influence around the world should not be underestimated. I remember when the Wallace sword left Stirling to visit New York, I'm told that an airline seat had to be booked for it. This was before the current airlines restrictions. I can't imagine a 5'4" broadsword getting through security these days. Also, in the museum collection is the niche collection of pewter, a collection of global significance. And the highlight for me is a Roman nipple protector, which is a fascinating piece. Apparently these were worn by soldiers under their armour to prevent chafing. It is a collection that attracts international academic and design interest. For me, grateful for the honourable gentleman's support. For me, local museums are a superb way of people interacting with their own local stories. They are a way of understanding local stories. In Stirling, it is a way for us to understand the local way we interact with the national nature of our history. Stirling is a place where many things of national importance have happened and continue to happen, I hasten to add. I've already mentioned the battles of Bannockburn and Stirling Bridge.
My honourable friend for giving way. Does the honourable member agree with me that it isn't just local artefacts that you can see in local museums, but in fact artefacts that represent the entire history of our country, Great Britain?
And Chippenham Museum is currently having a refurb by the Arts Council, which will allow them to have artefacts from the V&A.
Intervention. So if the Honourable Lady wishes to make a speech, by all means do so. Mr Kerr.
I welcome the news that my honourable friend has just shared with colleagues. I've already mentioned the battle. I can't mention this too often, of course, as the Member of Parliament for Stirling, the Battle of Bannockburn and the Battle of Stirling Bridge. There are major aspects of the Wars of Independence that happened in Stirling. Globally significant events happened in our backyard. We feel differently about these events than people from elsewhere in Scotland because they're part of our local history. Stirling was besieged during the Battle of Bannockburn, but Stirling High School at this point was already a 150-year-old school. So this is 1314, 150 years before Stirling High School was established. And I often wonder whether the pupils got the day off for the Battle of Bannockburn when the battle was fought. Globally, this is an important turning point in the history of Western Europe. Nationally, it solidifies Scotland's place in the world for 300 years, and locally, people had to live with it, and still have to live with it today, and we're proud of it. In order to understand these events in their entirety, we have to understand how the global, national and local all fit together. And the Stirling Smith has the caltrops that would have been used to immobilise the English infantry in the 14th century, as well as souvenirs and guidebooks that were sold from the visitor centre in the 19th century. The Smith is literally a stakeholder, as a number of the wooden stakes that may have been used at the Battle of Bannockburn itself. The effort over many years to preserve and protect our history is breathtaking, Mrs. Mayne. In history, the Smith prevented the destruction of the Stirling heads from Stirling Castle, which were being rolled down the hill for the entertainment of troops stationed at the castle. Allegedly, a museum curator dug the original plans for the Wallace Monument out of a skip. The museum team encouraged the donation of a piece of tarpaulin that was covering someone's woodpile, which turned out to be the miners' banner from the Flynn pit during the 1984 strike. We cannot underestimate the importance of museums in preserving our local, national and global history. And much of it is done.
He's making a very good speech on very important matters, but it is also recognised that it isn't just about fixed museum space. There's also temporary museum space, such as the Kerr in Solihull, which has many fine exhibitions of art, local histories and many people's stories.
I absolutely acknowledge that fact.
Will you agree with me that, like parks, museums deserve special protection, because at the moment there is no protection to either of those particularly important features which everyone values?
The museums and parks deserve the protection and the affection of the community which they will have, as was witnessed in Stirling at the time of the threat to the Stirling Smith Museum. So the Friends of the Smith, I just want to mention them in passing, Mrs. Mayne, because they devote hours of their time to raise money, conduct tours and help out in many ways to ensure that the Stirling Smith Museum operates fully, in evidence of the affection and devotion that local people have for their museum. This brings me to the Dunblane Museum. The Dunblane Museum started life as the Dunblane Cathedral Museum. It's a fantastic museum dedicated to preserving the history of the ancient borough of Dunblane. It has a nationally significant collection of communion tokens, the largest in the UK. It holds many items from the cathedral in Dunblane, and perhaps my favourite. It has a bag that belonged to an 18th century newspaper boy or girl. This is a museum that truly delivers. Boom, boom. The fact that the Dunblane Museum is entirely staffed by volunteers shows the dedication and the service of the members of the community, such as the Honorary Curator, Marjorie Davis, and the rest of the team. These are people who want their community, who want to serve their community, and have been doing so since it was set up to protect the museum collection in 1943. 10,000 visitors it attracts every year. And people leave knowing more about Dunblane and its long and distinguished history. Volunteers struggle, though, because so often we put more and more expectations in regulatory terms onto them. We require them to register with the charity regulator. We require health and safety protection. We require data protection. And all this adds to the burden of the volunteer groups and disproportionately affects independent volunteer museums who have to do this while raising the money to keep the lights on. Forms and applications are the bane of all charitable organisations' lives, and we have a duty to keep it as minimal as we can while still protecting the public. I saw the submission of the Stirling Smith to have it recognised as a museum of national significance, and it was a vast document, akin to a PhD thesis. And the third museum that I wish to mention in my area, and I must mention, is the Argyll and Southern Highlanders Museum. Stirling has a long and distinguished connection with the military of this country, and the Argyll and Southern Highlanders we claim as our own regiment. For this august institution, dedicated to the history of the old regiment, I cannot imagine that filling in a few forms would intimidate them, having fought 2 world wars and countless other conflicts around the world. Preserving the history of our military is essential, and museums like this play a huge part in telling people the story of a regiment now submerged into the Royal Regiment of Scotland. That is a part of our history and not our future. Continues to be of note, that it is a part of our history and not of our future, continues to be a note of sadness to me and many other people in Stirling area. But the history must be preserved, Mrs. Mayne. They have a superb collection of objects and artefacts from hundreds of years of military conflict the Argylls have been involved with. They hold family medals in their vaults, making them accessible for future generations and preventing loss. Again, the local family history stories, mixed with our national story of military commitment, playing its part in a global history, from the Khyber Pass to the fields of France. So local museums make a huge contribution to life in the United Kingdom. They preserve our heritage, they help us understand who we are, and they create the golden thread from the local to the national and on to the global. Which brings me on to a number of questions that I would like to raise. And I am afraid that there are some differences between England and Scotland on these issues, and I acknowledge them from the outset. I would like to question why this should be the case, given the level of cooperation around the UK. I'm not now suggesting, before I am interrupted by my colleague over here, some kind of a power grab, I hasten to add. I am calling for better collaboration and cooperation, as was mentioned and hinted at earlier in an intervention about the British Museum. The national collections in London, Edinburgh and Cardiff should be spread out and accessible. In order to do this, we need a shake-up of how we indemnify the objects in a museum. Now, I've waxed lyrical about the museums in my constituency, and you might think that I'm talking about a museum of national, if not global, significance when I talk about the Smith. The real tragedy is that the Smith is not considered to be such. The bar for a local museum to be considered a museum of national importance is set worryingly high. The committee that makes these decisions is known as the Committee of Significance. Despite an application outlining all of the wondrous national and international significant elements of the museum, it is not considered to be of national significance. Perth and Clydebank museums are museums of national significance, while Stirling and Kirkcaldy, despite its linoleum and superb art collection, recently had their applications knocked back. This is not right, Mrs. Mayne. Setting museums up against each other is not a useful or good thing to do, and I would question the judgment of those charged with such decisions. The Mendoza Review in England seems to address some of these issues, and I would raise the question as to why this cannot also be addressed in Scotland. The question of how museums can gain government indemnity requires some thought. Government indemnity allows museums to access insurance for items that would be prohibitively expensive to insure. The major national collections are disjointed in how they make decisions about this. They need to consider a single indemnity scheme across the UK, which would help museums lend confidently and borrow well to enrich local communities around the country. It would allow the national collections to be available throughout these islands, bringing exciting and uplifting exhibits to the whole of the United Kingdom. The treasure trove rules should also be considered. Again, in Scotland, we have a different regime, although it follows the English system fairly closely. Treasure trove allows people who have found items to sell them to a museum with an assessed reward. The level of reward, which has to be paid by museums, makes it difficult for local museums to acquire these items. I would suggest that a scheme to make museums able to acquire locally found items at a cheaper rate would help. The example would be the golden torques found near Blair Drummond in my constituency. These torques are beautiful and superb examples of Celtic craftsmanship. But to see them, people have to go to Edinburgh, where they are part of a large collection. This removes their local significance and what they tell us about the Celtic trading tradition in Stirlingshire, to add to a national story. When artefacts are removed from their local context, they lose that part of their story while contributing only to the national or the global. The Dumfries hoard also suffered the same fate, where the local museum was deemed unsecure to show it and did not have the resources to buy it themselves. This is one of the largest hoards of Viking materials discovered recently. Artefacts of huge importance to Dumfriesshire were removed from the community they were found in. Now, when we consider issues like the treasure trove rules or the issues of government indemnity, more flexibility is needed. By locking away our treasures, whether they be national or local, we make our story smaller and we lose a part of our identity.
Thank you. I'm very interested to hear your points about sort of repatriating, if you like, various items from collections. But would the Honourable Member acknowledge that some of this is to do simply with the conditions that are required for these items to be kept in, and so support and extra investment is required for that?
I understand that what I'm proposing is not without challenges, but it's the right thing to do, to put these locally discovered artefacts, which are critical to the local story of the communities we live in the community, so people can have the marvellous experience of understanding who they are in a long line of generations of people who lived in that area. And
I'm really grateful. Would the Honourable Member congratulate the National Railway Museum, who recently gifted one of its engines to Swanage Railway in order that it could be returned to its home environment, but also enjoyed by a wider population?
Sounds like a jolly good idea. The adage of being risky.
Again, following his train of thought, I wonder what his thoughts are on repatriating the Lewis chessmen from the British Museum up to the Western Isles.
He's given a moment to respond to one intervention before another intervention is thrown his way. But, Mr. Kerr, you might wish to deal with any residual remarks that you had from the previous intervention.
I'm very happy with the remarks I offered in connection with the first intervention. And on the second intervention, I understand the merits, as I am trying to make clear in my speech, of making the artefacts of these islands available to people, the whole people of these islands. And they ought to be accessible on the basis of not words like repatriation and so forth, but in terms of being able to be available to be displayed. And I understand there are challenges to do with this, but we should address those challenges. These things, these items, they tell our story. And they should be available to us so that we understand who we are and what our progenitors have done and what our future holds. All of these things, this golden thread that I'm trying to describe. The old adage of being risk-aware rather than risk-averse is needed here, lest we stop people from accessing those parts of our heritage found in the treasure trove or in treasure trove or in the national collections. We will all be richer if we move in this direction. No, I don't want to dwell on the issue of museum funding, particularly as the particular issues around museum funding in my own constituency have been resolved thanks to public pressure. But I'm sure many members will want to reflect on the issue of funding. And there is one point that I would like to make. New acquisitions within museums are essential to not only enriching and enlivening the position of the local museum, but as a way of recording the present which will turn into the past. I am sure I'm not alone among members to be astonished to see things from my childhood enshrined in local museums. I recently attended an exhibition in a museum and discovered that a picture of my class of 1976 was now one of the exhibits. So I stand before you, partially at least, as a museum exhibit. Whether it be old food packaging, shop equipment.
The Honourable Member picked up on his childhood, indeed, which was in my constituency of Angus, and I just wanted to highlight the importance of museums in Angus, such as J.M. Barrie's, the creator of Peter Pan. His birthplace is in Kerrymuir, and does the Honourable Member agree that indeed that they are incredibly valuable to our local economy and drive thousands of tourists into the local area, which wouldn't come otherwise?
It would be impossible to consider a visit to Kerrymuir without visiting the home place of the great J.M. Barrie, and likewise a visit to Forfar without visiting the Meffin, which is another great museum and exhibition place. So whether it's old food packaging, shop equipment, the other accoutrements of daily life, these bring forward memories. Now, I wish to consider that these be from the recent past, but it turns out that Flared Trousers and John Denver albums are museum pieces now. Local museums can and must be allowed to acquire items of significance from their local community as they go, collecting history as it happens. They must have the money to do this, And while philanthropy and corporate giving play a huge part in this, they need to have state funding to keep the lights on while they collect. I'm proud that in Stirling we have a common good fund which allows the acquisition of goods for the Smith collection alongside a strong corporate and philanthropic effort. We should reflect on what happens when this goes wrong. To that end, I would like to touch briefly on the tragedy of the McFarlane collection in Bridge of Allen. This museum was unloved, and then the army was billeted in the museum. During that time, the soldiers used the large collection of stuffed animals for target practice. And after the war, the museum was turned into a concert hall of some significance. And many in Bridge of Allen, my hometown, will still talk fondly of the time that the Beatles played at the Museum Hall in Bridge of Allen. Now the building lay derelict for a long time and has now been turned into flats. These are lovely flats, but the community of Bridge of Allen is a bit poorer for the McFarlane Museum no longer being there. The community of Stirling is a bit poorer, and I would contend that we are all a bit poorer. Now, I wish to conclude with a few short comments about political history, because Stirling has an incredible political history, which is well recorded in its museum, especially the Smith. And I'm often reminded that Stirling has recently produced 2 Secretaries of State for Scotland, Tom Johnston and Michael Forsyth, as well as the Prime Minister, Henry Campbell Bannerman. The place of honour that they have in Stirling as a city proud of its heritage only seeks to put more pressure on the sitting member. It was a young Harold Wilson who stared up at the statue of Henry Campbell Bannerman that adorns our city centre and thought it would be a good thing to be Prime Minister. And the former member for Lanark, John Bontine Cunningham Graham, has the record of founding 2 of the political parties represented in the House of Commons, not mine, Mrs May, but the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish National Party. And it's also important to commemorate that as a local boy made good in Stirling. He's one of our own. And Stirling Smith has his riding boots, his smiddy. Graham was famous as a horse breeder and adventurer, and most impressively, his coffin plate, which was considered to be too nice to be buried with him and was preserved for posterity. I should also say that one of the fascinating things in the Smith Museum is a facsimile copy of the 16th century Stirling heads which are hung in the museum, and one of them bears an uncanny, striking resemblance to another great Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Now, I knew that would get a response from certain members present here today. I've spoken long enough about the collections of my local museums and what they can tell us about our present and our future, and I'd like to leave you with a description of one item in the collection. In the corner of the Smith is a piece of mutton bone. Unremarkable, it may seem, this bone is of huge local, national and international importance. The bone was removed from the throat of young James Drummond, who had been slowly dying as the bone lay lodged in his throat. James was saved, and this inspired a deep religious faith within the Drummond family, who used their fortune to build a great deal in Stirling. They built the internationally significant cemetery grounds, which follow a pattern of heaven laid out in the Bible. They built an agricultural improvement business, which improved land and made Stirling the agriculture capital it is today. They built a huge religious tract publishing house and the needs of their workforce by the invention of the pre-packed sandwich. So Greggs have Drummonds to thank. The religious and temperance printing venture facilitated the construction of the large post office, which is now, ironically, a public house. They were very much in favour of temperance. And to top it all off, in 1843, this, of course, was the first ever recorded tracheotomy. A local museum preserves our history, Mrs. Main. They preserve our culture. They allow us to look to the future, securing the knowledge that we're building on a strong foundation. I would contend, however, that all the local museums that we have are, in a sense, national museums. They all tell the small stories, the stories of the people, great and small, who all play their part in the history of our nation. They tell the big stories of movements of people, of great men and women, and technological change through the ages. So my message today, Mrs. Main, is a strong one and a clear one. Support our local museums.